Angeles in 1937, billionaire Hannon is writing a letter for an employee at a hotel. In this letter he confesses he's made a very dangerous discovery that will very likely get him killed. When he's done, he goes to the ballroom and gives the letter to bartender Ashton, saying someone called Douglas will come to pick it up later. After Hannon goes home, Ashton opens the envelope to read the letter, which leaves him quite disturbed. Moments later Hannon makes it home and gets in bed with his wife. All of a sudden the room disappears and he wakes up in a lab in 1999. It turns out the 1937 city and all the people in it are part of a virtual reality simulator developed by Hannon's company. He leaves the lab to go to his favorite bar, where he has some drinks and takes his medicine while some creepy men watch. Then he uses the payphone to leave a message for Douglas on the answering machine. The call is interrupted by a mysterious person appearing at the back door who Hannon is surprised to see and follows to a dark alley. When he's about to share his discovery, the stranger takes out a knife to stab him, instantly killing him. The next morning Hannon's protege Douglas plays the messages on his machine before going to his bathroom, where he's horrified to find blood on the sink and a blood-stained shirt in his trash can. One of the messages is from the police, telling him to urgently go to the police station. Douglas doesn't hear the other messages and immediately rushes to the station where he meets Detective McBain, who shows him a dead body. A devastated Douglas confirms that's Hannon and answers McBain's questions, explaining he worked for Hannon for 6 years but they also were close friends. Then McBain and Douglas go to Hannon's office. The detective wants to know about the company's projects but Douglas only explains they work on computer software, the rest it's confidential information. At that moment they notice a woman named Jane in another room and Douglas is surprised to hear her say she's Hannon's daughter because his boss never mentioned having kids. He also has the feeling he's seen her before. While McBain takes Jane aside for questioning, Douglas visits the 13th floor. Here he visits a programmer named Whitney, who is grieving for Hannon. He tells him about the simulation they've been working on and how Hannon has been constantly visiting that version of Los Angeles even though they still needed months of work for the first trial. When Douglas asks him if he knew about Jane's existence, Whitney answers he didn't. Then Douglas returns to the lobby and sees Jane leaving in a cab. He's suspicious of her and asks the receptionist where she's staying to follow her. Afterward, McBain interrogates Whitney about the company's research. Whitney explains their virtual reality is filled with simulated self-learning people who are unaware that they're computer programs and that their choice to simulate Los Angeles in 1937 was because Hannon wanted to revisit his younger days. At the hotel, Douglas finds Jane and confronts her in the lobby, asking her about her last conversation with Hannon. Jane explains she lived in France and a few days ago her father asked her to come to the USA to help him shut down the company. Then Jane meets with Hannon's lawyer to discuss her father's will, only to learn that Hannon made a last-minute change and the company will be going to Douglas. At the same time, McBain gives this same news to Douglas, who is as shocked and confused as Jane. This change now makes Douglas a suspect. Douglas says that on the day of the murder he didn't talk to Hannon, causing McBain to explain that Hannon's calling card was used right before he died. At home, Douglas hears the rest of the messages in his machine and finally finds Hannon telling him about the letter he hid in the simulation. Hannon said he found something amazing, but the recording ends when he asks the mysterious person, "How did you find me?" Douglas immediately rushes to the office and after searching for Hannon's information on the computer, he asks Whitney to connect him. Whitney at first refuses and explains how dangerous it is, but Douglas changes his mind by explaining the clues point at him, so either he killed Hannon at forgot or he's being framed. When Whitney says he can only give him an hour, Douglas convinces him to make it 2, which is dangerous. Then Douglas lies down in the simulation chamber and after lots of lights and transferring time, he appears in the virtual reality, having taken over the body of a bank clerk. It feels very strange and Douglas has to run to the bathroom to put himself together. The boss says he looks terrible and gives him the day off. Douglas leaves the building and is amazed by the details of the old Los Angeles, which feels absolutely real. Whitney told him that when Hannon connected to this reality he occupied the body of an antique shop owner in Pasadena, so once he's calmed down Douglas heads there in a cab. Soon Douglas makes it to the store and is shocked to discover that the owner Grierson looks exactly like Hannon. The man doesn't recognize him but he does think Douglas looks familiar. Next, Douglas goes to the hotel and asks the dancers for information on Hannon until one of them tells him to see Ashton. Douglas is shocked to see Ashton's face matches Whitney but doesn't comment on it, he just starts asking questions. Ashton explains Hannon is a regular client and he always goes for young girls, which also surprises Douglas. When he asks about the letter, Ashton pretends he doesn't know what he's talking about. Suddenly Douglas starts feeling ill because his time is about to run out, so he runs to the bathroom as his body starts having a seizure. In just a second Douglas wakes up in the lab still feeling sick while in the simulation. Ashton notices that the body that Douglas used doesn't know where he is or how he got there. In the lab, Whitney helps Douglas calm down and scolds him for choosing 2 hours. However, his mood improves when Douglas tells him how good and real the virtual reality is. Unfortunately, he gets upset again when he hears that Hannon has been using this virtual reality to get it done with girls. The conversation is interrupted when a guard announces someone is asking for Douglas in the lobby. Douglas goes down and meets Tom, who explains he saw Hannon in the bar the other night. He also asks to speak privately, so Douglas takes him to the parking lot. After asking for money, Tom begins beating Douglas up while accusing him of taking Hannon. Douglas defends himself and hits back, smashing Tom's head into a car window. Tom calls Douglas crazy and part of America's Most Wanted before running away. Sometime later, Douglas calls Jane and invites her to dinner. He tells her about the message that Hannon left him, yet he can't remember if he saw or talked to Hannon on the day of his death. Jane advises Douglas to tell everything to the police and stay away from the simulation, which may be causing the memory problems. Douglas thinks he met Jane before, but she refuses to talk about her past. She asks Douglas to dance and finally admits she thinks she knows him too. After explaining that déjà vu may be a sign of love at first sight, Jane and Douglas share a kiss. That night the cops come to Douglas' apartment to arrest him as the main suspect in Hannon's case. At the station, McBain explains that Douglas' car has been found in the security footage of the bar where the murder happened. The detective's theory says that Douglas killed Hannon to stop him from shutting down the company. Tom has also told the police that he saw Douglas leaving the bar with Hannon, but a few hours ago the cops found Tom dead. Douglas spends the night in jail, but in the morning, Jane bails him out by presenting an alibi in his favor. Determined to find the truth, Douglas goes to the lab and logs into the simulation, setting the timer for 2 hours again. However, he fails to press a button and the time doesn't start. The computer tries to warn him, but Douglas is already in the chamber. When he appears in the virtual reality, Douglas is in the middle of a dance competition. He immediately abandons his partner and returns to the antique shop, hitting the window with a rock to make Grierson come out. At first, Grierson doesn't want to see him, but Douglas explains he can tell him why he sometimes loses time and wakes up with no idea of where he is. Grierson admits that after waking up, he sees flashes of another man's life and his wife has smelled the girls on his clothes. He also mentions he's found something strange under his bed. He takes out a briefcase containing a very fancy suit, saying he never bought it and doesn't remember wearing it, but still fits him perfectly. Douglas realizes Hannon kept the suit here to wear it whenever he logged in. Afterward, Douglas takes Grierson to the hotel, where the staff calls him Hannon. When they enter the ballroom, Grierson concentrates as hard as he can to look for any traces of Hannon's memories. Seeing the girls helps, and he remembers that Hannon gave a letter to a man. When Grierson points at the bartender, Ashton notices and quickly sneaks out of the room. Douglas follows him into the locker room, where Ashton surprises him from behind with a gun. He admits he read the letter, which made him realize he's just an artificial creation. Ashton followed the instructions in Hannon's letter and drove to Tucson, going to every barricade that tried to stop him. In Tucson, he was able to see the edge of the world, which made him understand this reality is fake. He wants to know why Hannon and Douglas mess with people's minds and asks Douglas to show him what is truly real. Laughing like a maniac, Ashton shoots Douglas in the shoulder and the leg. When he gets ready to shoot him in the head, Douglas punches him and runs away. A chase ensues as Ashton continues to fire randomly, and Douglas wonders why the simulation hasn't ended yet. Ashton follows a trail of blood into the swimming pool and Douglas catches him by surprise to start beating him up. He takes Ashton's gun and puts it in his mouth while asking where's the letter, so Ashton hands it to him. However, it's bait to grab him again and start smashing Douglas against a column. Both men fall in the water and Ashton beats Douglas up some more before trying to drown him. When Douglas is about to stop breathing, Whitney pulls him out of the simulation. Seeing that face causes Douglas to punch his friend before realizing he's home. Afterward, Douglas tells Whitney that all the people in the simulation are as real as they are, with their own lives and feelings. He thinks they shouldn't be messing with their heads and that his project was a mistake. Whitney tries to convince him they just programmed it that way, but Douglas storms off. At the hotel, Douglas finds McBain waiting for him to tell him Jane has disappeared. After doing lots of research, McBain has confirmed that Hannon didn't have any kids and that there's no woman with Jane's name in the USA or France. Getting worried, Douglas finds the taxi driver who picked up Jane a few days ago and pays him in exchange for information. It turns out Jade took the cab to go to a neighborhood nearby, so Douglas visits the town and asks around until he discovers that the body Jane uses is a cashier at the grocery store. When Douglas walks in, she doesn't recognize him, but she does admit he looks familiar. With Ashton's story still in his head, Douglas follows the route described in the letter and goes through a few barriers before finding the edge of the world. He's shocked to discover a wall of code and wireframe, which means his reality in 1999 is as fake as the 1937 one. It also means he's not real either. Meanwhile, McBain finds the cashier who looks like Jane, but she doesn't recognize him. When McBain makes his officer check her records, he learns that her friends notice she's been going out all night and sleeping all day. At that moment, Jane enters the body and sees McBain outside, so she hides and calls Douglas to ask him to meet him at Hannon's office. Moments later, Jane is telling Douglas the whole truth. There are thousands of virtual worlds, but this one is the only one that ever created a simulation inside the simulation. Jane didn't kill Hannon. She was sent after his death to pretend to be his daughter and inherit the company. She was supposed to shut it down, but he tricked them by changing his will. Douglas body stabbed Hannon, but it happened while it was being controlled by a VR user, who happens to be her husband David. Jane explains her husband got addicted to the simulation and it corrupted him into becoming abusive. She thinks that since Douglas and Hannon saw the edge of the world, it proves they have a bit of soul in them and are real. Since the simulation started, Jane has been watching Douglas and falling in love with him. Douglas insists he isn't real and can't be loved, so Jane kisses him and they do the dirty. Meanwhile, Whitney connects himself to the virtual reality and appears in Ashton's body while he's driving. Whitney has to quickly dodge the traffic but ends up crashing against some boxes and cans anyway. While he looks at his new body in the mirror, the police surround him and ask for his license. He looks for it in the glove box and finds a gun, which he quickly hides before getting Ashton's wallet. The cop sees the license and believes the story of the car slipping in the rain, so he lets Whitney go. However, when he's about to leave, he hears a noise in the trunk. The officer makes Whitney open it and finds the bank teller's bleeding body tied up. He tries to arrest Whitney, who steps back in shock and is accidentally hit by another car. At that moment the timer ends and Whitney wakes up back in the lab. However, he doesn't know how to use the automatic doors and keeps poking things. The guard notices this strange behavior on the security cameras and calls Douglas to warn him. After Douglas leaves for the lab, Jane calls McBain. Minutes later, Douglas arrives at the company building and finds the guard unconscious on the ground with no gun. Then he checks on Whitney, who is laughing at the TV as if it was something new. By only exchanging a few words, Douglas realizes this is actually Ashton, who got to come back because Whitney was killed by the car. Douglas then explains to Ashton that this world is also fake, but Ashton still wants to see the place where he was born. The men get in the elevator and at that moment, Jane's husband David takes over Douglas' body. He stays quiet for now and takes Ashton to the room with all the computers that run the simulation program. While Ashton looks around, David finds the guard's gun and shoots Ashton twice to kill him. Moments later, David reunites with Jane, pretending to be Douglas at first. While they kiss, David reveals his real identity and starts beating Jane up for getting dirty with another man. He throws her on the bed and starts choking her, so Jane reaches for the alarm clock and hits him in the head. She starts running as David opens fire, rushing right into the elevator. When David tries to hold the door, she pounds on his hand until he lets go. A furious David starts shooting the elevator doors, but the bullets don't pierce it. When Jane makes it to the lobby, she discovers the front doors are locked. Soon David catches up to her and gets ready to shoot, but he misses and the bullet breaks the window instead. It turns out McBain came because Jane called him and shot David just in time. She planned her husband's death and Douglas' body all along to trap his consciousness in this world. Now McBain knows the truth and asks her not to send any more people from her world to this one. Moments later, Douglas wakes up in David's real body and looks around the new place, reading on the newspaper that it's the year 2024. Jane wakes up as well and shows Douglas the futuristic world she lives in. She also says hello to her dad on the beach. It was his face they used to design Hannon. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.